go.
And what can I do for you today, Miss Latz?
I've been having blood in my urine and a terrible pain in my womb, and I've got a lump.
A lump? Well, let's take a look. Unfortunately, it appears that you have a full-fledged tumor, Miss Latz, about the size of a nickel, purple, and extremely sensitive. I will have a sample examined in our pathology lab down the hall, but for now, I suggest you go home and Hawkins will be in touch for treatment.
Okay, thank you, doctor.
At the time that Henrietta came to the hospital with her tumor, a man named Richard Tillin was conducting a study to prove that the milder form of cervical cancer, epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, can transform to the malignant type. In order to do so, he was enlisting the help of Dr. George Guy, a leading cell culturist, to help him grow the first immortal human cell line in a laboratory. Therefore, all patients coming to the colored ward of Hopkins with cervical cancer were unknowingly having their cells harvested for testing at Guy's lab. I need you to process the sample right now. It's fresh from Hawkins. Lunch is over, Mary.
Yes, Dr. Guy.
George Guy was a very important figure in the field of cell culture at this time. After developing the HeLa cell line, Guy also made many important advances in the technology of his field as well. He standardized the shipping of cell cultures after much experimenting, and he also invented the innovative roller tube culturing technique, which we still use today. He also played around with different mediums. At this time, Guy's medium was a special brew consisting of chicken plasma, ground-up cow fetus, salts, and blood from the human umbilical cord. When Mary, his lab technician, would receive samples from Guy to process, she would cut them into very small tubes, millimeters in width, and place them in tubes with a small amount of medium. She would then walk them over to the incubator room and place them in the roller tube incubation machine. Usually, the cells would die off within days, but not in Henrietta's case. After 2 days, Mary would enter the incubation room and have the shock of her life, when Henrietta's cells, the cells you are watching Mary process, began doubling and tripling and soon had spread to 6 tubes and were continuing in the exponential growth.
Because of Guy's misplaced generosity, this cell line would soon be the leading cause for many a scientific controversy. Dr. Southam, defending his injection of cancer patients with Henrietta's virulent and cancerous cell line without their consent.
To use the word cancer in connection with any clinical procedure on an ill person is potentially deleterious to that person's well-being because it may suggest to him, rightly or wrongly, that his diagnosis or that his prognosis is poor.
To withhold such emotionally disturbing but medically non-pertinent information is in the best tradition of responsible clinical procedure.
His actions were seen to be in almost direct violation of the Nuremberg Code, a moral code developed to prevent the type of terrible experiments performed by Nazi doctors during the Holocaust. By the end of his study, Southam had injected over 600 people with cancerous cells without their consent. However, as a symbol of the moral confusion in the field of human testing, which had never really been viable before HeLa cells, Southam was elected president of the American Association for Cancer Research in the midst of this scandal.
As more scientists caught on to patenting cell lines similar to HeLa, an important controversy came to light regarding any patient's potential ownership of cell lines originating from him or her, and whether or not they deserve monetary gain. A man named John Moore, after having his violently cancerous spleen removed, sued for rights to his own valuable cell line, the Moe cell line, which had been harvested and cultured without his consent. This was a precedent-settling case. In the end, the researcher who had taken his cells without his consent, Dr. Gold, won. This was mostly due to widespread panic in the research world at the idea of patients owning and distributing these valuable cell lines at their own will. However, the judge strongly suggested that doctors in the future at least tell their patients what they're doing with the cells.
However, many scientists appeared to respond with arrogance and to pay little attention to the judge's warning. The dean of Stanford University's School of Medicine said, in regard to patients not giving consent for the use of their cells, "I guess you could sit there with your ruptured appendix and negotiate," essentially suggesting that the patient might risk not having the needed medical procedure performed unless the patient would allow his or her cells to be harvested. And with the introduction of hybrids using HeLa cells, the great debate of man playing God in genetics research began, with some very interesting representations of what was going on in labs. This also caused Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, who lacked extensive formal education, to panic, thinking that they were monstrously disfigured copies of her mother walking around, suffering through the pains of being genetically combined with different animals.
In an incident known as the HeLa bomb, a researcher named Stanley Gartner arrived at the Second Decennial Review Conference on Cell Tissue and Organ Culture and stated to over 700 top researchers that HeLa strains were so virulent that possibly many other new cell lines were in fact contaminated, and suggested that the discovery of spontaneous transformation, in which cells seemingly became cancerous at random, was not in fact a new discovery, but simply the contamination of that cell line with HeLa. He gave a list of cell lines contaminated with HeLa, known as HeLa contaminants. Though many frustrated and stubborn researchers refused to believe that their patented cell lines were contaminated, some, like Robert Stevenson, began to develop genetic tests to determine contamination, a revolutionary step towards secure cell lines.
While all of these scientific crises were occurring, there was a moral crisis going on as well. While some research companies were getting rich off of the HeLa cell line, Henrietta's own family was suffering in poverty, without health insurance, unaware that her cells were making millions.
Although HeLa fueled these many scientific and ethical crises, it also contributed to many great medical advances. The HeLa cells were used to prove that Dr. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine was in fact effective on humans. Previously, he had only been able to test it on monkeys, and had been looking for a safe and viable method in which to test it on humans. This was crucial because at the time there was a terrible polio epidemic. Some of the first genetic hybrids were made using the HeLa cell line. Chicken cells were fused with HeLa, as well as a human-mouse cross, and we now use some of this technology to harvest organs such as ears from mice.
HeLa also helped in the following discoveries: isolating stem cells, cloning, discovering that humans in fact had 46 chromosomes when scientists had originally thought there were 48. HeLa cells were also placed in atomic bombs to test effects of atomic radiation on human cells. And finally, HeLa cells were even sent into space to determine the effect of zero gravity on human cells. The cell line HeLa, unknowingly donated by a much-loved and missed woman named Henrietta Lacks, has had a massive impact on scientific research and will continue to have an impact in years to come.